The elderly woman counted the crumpled bills twice, her weathered fingers trembling as she spread them across the scratched counter. 37 cents short. Her eyes darted nervously between the steaming container of soup and the young cashier who watched her with patient silence. Behind her, the lunch rush crowd shuffled impatiently, phones buzzing, conversations flowing, unaware that Margaret Chen was about to walk away hungry again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. "I thought I had enough. I can put the bread roll back." The cashier, a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands, looked at the meager meal before him. A cup of vegetable soup and a dinner roll. The total came to $8.37. She had exactly $8. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 quarters, and placed them gently beside her money. "Looks like you're all set," he said with a warm smile. "Enjoy your meal, ma'am." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to protest, to refuse the charity, but hunger won over pride. She nodded gratefully, gathered her food, and found a corner table where she could eat in peace. Unaware that the man who had just changed her day was David Rodriguez, the owner of Cornerstone Bistro and 3 other restaurants across the city. David Rodriguez had not planned to work the register that Tuesday afternoon. He had come to Cornerstone Bistro for a routine inspection, the kind that kept his restaurants running smoothly and his reputation intact. But when the lunch rush hit and one of his cashiers called in sick, he found himself tying an apron around his waist and stepping behind the counter. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a man whose name appeared on Forbes' 40 under 40 inches list, whose restaurants had been featured in 3 major food magazines taking orders for turkey sandwiches and counting change. But something about the anonymity felt liberating. Behind the register, he was not David Rodriguez, restaurant mogul. He was simply Dave, the helpful new guy who seemed to know the menu surprisingly well. David had built his empire from nothing, but that nothing had teeth. 20 years ago, he had been sleeping in his car, working 3 jobs, saving every penny to open his first restaurant. He remembered the gnawing emptiness of skipped meals, the humiliation of digging through couch cushions for lunch money, the way hunger could make even the smallest kindness feel monumental. That was why, when Margaret Chen stood before him counting crumpled bills, he did not hesitate. He had been her once. The difference was that now he had the power to be the person he had needed all those years ago. Margaret Chen had once been a successful elementary school teacher. For 32 years, she had shaped young minds, volunteered for weekend reading programs, and spent her own money on classroom supplies. Her modest pension should have been enough for a comfortable retirement, but life had other plans. First came the diagnosis. Parkinson's disease crept in slowly, stealing her balance, her handwriting, her independence. The medical bills followed like dominoes falling, each one larger than the last. Her insurance covered some treatments but not others. Physical therapy, medications, adaptive equipment, the costs mounted relentlessly. Then her landlord sold the building. Margaret, who had lived in the same apartment for 15 years, suddenly faced rent that doubled overnight. On a fixed income already stretched thin by medical expenses, she had no choice but to move to a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were the evening lullaby and safety was negotiable. Now, at 71, Margaret counted pennies for soup. She had applied for additional assistance programs, but the waiting lists were long and the requirements complex. Pride had been her companion for 7 decades, but pride could not fill an empty stomach. The Cornerstone Bistro had become her guilty pleasure, a small rebellion against the cheap canned soups that comprised most of her meals. Once a week, if her medication costs had not been too high, she allowed herself the luxury of a real meal in a real restaurant, surrounded by the comfortable chatter of people living their lives. She never expected kindness from a stranger. She certainly never expected that stranger to be watching her long after she had finished her soup and quietly left the restaurant. David found himself thinking about Margaret for the rest of his shift. There had been something in her eyes, a dignity that refused to bend even under obvious hardship. She had not made a scene, had not demanded special treatment or launched into a sob story. She had simply accepted her situation with grace and been genuinely grateful for a small act of kindness. As he walked through the restaurant later that evening, reviewing the day's receipts and checking that everything was properly cleaned and secured, David noticed details he had missed during his previous visits. The way some customers lingered over their meals, making a single cup of coffee last an hour. The careful way others examined prices before ordering. The small stack of business cards near the register advertising food assistance programs. His restaurant served a community, not just customers. And that community included people like Margaret, people who deserved dignity, along with their meals. The next week, David returned to the register. This time, it was intentional. He had arranged for coverage of his other responsibilities and committed to working the lunch shift at Cornerstone Bistro. When the staff asked questions, he deflected with vague mentions of wanting to stay connected to the frontline operations. Margaret appeared again on Tuesday, exactly 1 week after their first encounter. This time, she had enough money for her soup and roll, but David noticed her calculating the tax twice before confirming her order. When she handed over her payment, he saw that her hands shook more than they had the previous week. "How's your week been?" he asked as he rang up her order, a question he had never asked during his executive visits to the restaurant. Margaret looked surprised that he remembered her. "Oh, it's been fine, thank you for asking. You're very kind." "First week on the job," David said, which was technically true. "Still learning everyone's usual orders." Margaret smiled. "Well, mine's easy to remember. Same thing every Tuesday." As she walked to her usual corner table, David made a mental note. Every Tuesday. Same order. Same careful counting of money. Same quiet dignity in the face of obvious struggle. Over the following weeks, their brief interactions became the highlight of both their Tuesdays. David learned that Margaret had been a teacher, that she lived alone, that she loved reading mystery novels from the library. Margaret learned that Dave was new to restaurant work but seemed to have a natural gift for it, that he remembered everyone's names, and that he had an unusual knowledge of food costs and inventory management for someone who had supposedly just started. Neither of them mentioned the obvious questions. Margaret never asked why a cashier seemed to know so much about restaurant operations. David never asked why an obviously educated woman was counting coins for soup. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday in October. Margaret arrived looking more frail than usual, her umbrella broken, her coat soaked through. She approached the counter with her usual careful smile, but David could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "The usual?" he asked gently. Margaret nodded, then hesitated. "Actually, just the soup today. No roll." David rang up the soup, knowing without looking that she was short again. But this time, instead of quietly covering the difference, he made a decision that would change both their lives. "You know what?" he said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "You're our 100th customer today." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That means your meal's on the house. It was a complete fabrication. Margaret was nowhere near the 100th customer, and Cornerstone Bistro had no such promotion. But David delivered the lie with such conviction that nearby diners smiled, and a few even applauded. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy rather than resignation. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Absolutely sure," David replied, adding a roll and a small container of the day's featured dessert to her tray. "Congratulations." As Margaret walked to her table, David felt something shift inside his chest. It was not just about the money. It was about dignity, about allowing someone to receive kindness without the weight of charity, about recognizing that sometimes a small lie in service of someone's pride was more valuable than the truth. Word of Dave's kindness spread through the restaurant's regular customer base. The story grew in the telling. The humble cashier who paid for struggling customers, meals, who remembered everyone's names, who treated each person like family regardless of how much they spent. But with recognition came scrutiny. The restaurant's assistant manager, Sandra Kim, began paying closer attention to the new cashier, who seemed unusually invested in customer satisfaction. She noticed that he never needed training on the point-of-sale system, that he knew the recipes for dishes he had supposedly never prepared, that he made operational suggestions that were surprisingly sophisticated for someone with his stated experience. More troubling, the register often came up short at the end of shifts when Dave worked, never by much, a few dollars here and there, but enough to establish a pattern. Sandra faced a dilemma. Dave was popular with customers and staff alike, but if he was stealing from the register, she had a responsibility to address it. Sandra decided to watch more carefully. She began reviewing security footage from Dave's shifts, looking for evidence of theft. What she found instead puzzled her even more. The footage showed Dave repeatedly adding his own money to cover shortfalls when customers could not afford their meals. He did it discreetly, quickly, without fanfare. A quarter here, a dollar there, sometimes more. He was not stealing from the restaurant. He was subsidizing its customers. But Sandra also noticed something else in the footage. The way Dave moved through the restaurant during slow periods was not the hesitant exploration of a new employee. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew every corner, every procedure, every detail of the operation. He adjusted thermostats without asking permission, restocked supplies without being told where to find them, and made minor repairs with tools that appeared from his own pockets. Sandra had worked at Cornerstone Bistro for 3 years. She knew the owner only as a name on her paychecks and a figure who occasionally appeared for formal meetings. She had never seen David Rodriguez up close, had never connected the distant executive with the warm, generous man working beside her. But as she watched the security footage more carefully, recognition dawned slowly, and then, all at once. Margaret's world collapsed on a Wednesday morning in November. She had been expecting her monthly pension check, the small amount that kept her housed and fed. Instead, she received a letter explaining that due to a clerical error, her previous month's payment had been calculated incorrectly. She owed the state $412 to be deducted from her next 3 payments. Margaret read the letter 5 times, hoping the words would change. They did not. Without her full pension, she could not pay rent and buy food and medication. Something had to give. She spent the morning calling various assistance offices, navigating phone trees, waiting on hold, explaining her situation to representatives who were sympathetic but powerless to help immediately. Everyone had programs and resources, but all of them had waiting periods, application processes, documentation requirements that would take weeks to fulfill. By Tuesday, Margaret had eaten nothing but crackers and peanut butter for 3 days. Her medication made her nauseous on an empty stomach, but she could not afford to skip doses. When she arrived at Cornerstone Bistro, she had no money for food. She came anyway, drawn by habit and the hope that seeing friendly faces might ease the gnawing anxiety in her chest. Margaret sat at her usual table without ordering, nursing a free glass of water and trying to work up the courage to leave. She watched other customers enjoying their meals, inhaling the aromas that made her empty stomach clench with longing. David noticed her immediately. Margaret always ordered first thing, always sat down with her food within minutes of arriving. But today she sat empty-handed, staring out the window with an expression he recognized from his own hungry past. He approached her table during a lull between orders. "Hi, Margaret. Everything okay today?" Margaret looked up, startled. "Oh, hi, Dave. Yes, everything's fine. I was just thinking." David could see the careful way she held herself, the proud straightness of her spine that refused to communicate need even when need was obvious. He had perfected the same posture during his own lean years. "Can I bring you your usual?" he asked gently. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Not today, thank you. I'm not very hungry." David heard the lie and recognized it for what it was. Not deception, but dignity protecting itself. He had told the same lie countless times. "You know what?" he said, his voice warm but matter-of-fact. "I made too much soup for the lunch prep. The kitchen's gonna have to throw it away unless someone helps us out. Would you mind taking some off our hands?" It was another kind lie, but delivered with such casual sincerity that Margaret could accept it without feeling like charity. "Well, if it's going to go to waste—" "Great," David said. I'll be right back. He returned with Margaret's usual order, plus a small container of homemade bread and a thermos of soup for later. For helping us reduce food waste, he explained with a conspiratorial wink. As Margaret ate, David watched from behind the counter. He saw the careful way she savored each spoonful, the grateful glances she sent his way, the slight relaxation in her shoulders as hunger gave way to nourishment. And he made a decision that would expose everything he had worked to keep hidden. After Margaret left, David pulled Sandra aside. I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep it confidential. Sandra nodded, curious about the serious tone. That woman who was just here, Margaret, I think she's struggling more than she lets on. I want to set up a tab for her, prepaid, so she can eat here whenever she needs to without having to worry about payment. Sandra studied his face. Dave, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure you can afford? I can afford it, David interrupted. The question is whether the restaurant can handle the arrangement without making it obvious. I don't want her to feel like charity. Sandra was quiet for a moment. The request was unusual, generous beyond anything she had seen from a part-time cashier. Combined with everything else she had observed about Dave, pieces of a puzzle began clicking into place. Who are you really? She asked quietly. David met her eyes and saw that denial would be pointless. Sandra was too observant, had noticed too much. Can we talk privately after closing? That evening, after the last customer had left and the staff had finished cleaning, David and Sandra sat across from each other in a corner booth. The restaurant felt different in the quiet, more intimate, more honest. I'm David Rodriguez, he said simply. I own this place. Sandra sat back, processing the confirmation of what she had begun to suspect. Why? She asked. Why pretend to be a cashier? Why not just, I don't know, implement programs through corporate channels? David was quiet for a long moment, looking around the restaurant he had built. Because corporate channels don't show you Margaret counting coins for soup, he said finally. They don't show you the customer who makes a single coffee last 2 hours because it's the only warm place they can afford to sit. They don't show you who we're really serving. He told Sandra about his own past, about sleeping in his car, about the kindness of strangers that had kept him fed and hopeful during the darkest period of his life. He explained how success had gradually insulated him from the struggles of his customers, how executive reports and profit margins had replaced human faces and individual stories. I started coming here to check operations, he admitted. But I stayed because I remembered what it felt like to be Margaret, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that my restaurants were supposed to serve people, not just profit. Sandra listened without judgment, understanding dawning in her expression. What happens now? She asked. Now you help me figure out how to do this right, David said. How to help people like Margaret without making them feel small. How to build community, not just serve food. The next morning, Sandra called an all-staff meeting. She introduced David properly, explaining that he had been working undercover to better understand the restaurant's operations and community impact. The revelation stunned the staff, but their shock quickly gave way to respect for an owner who cared enough to work alongside them. David addressed the team directly, his voice carrying none of the corporate polish they might have expected. I learned more working beside you for these past months than I had in years of executive meetings, he said. This restaurant serves a community, and we have a responsibility to that community that goes beyond profit margins. He announced the creation of the Cornerstone Community Fund, a program that would provide free meals to community members in need, funded by voluntary customer donations and matching contributions from the restaurant. More importantly, the program would operate with dignity. Recipients would receive vouchers that looked identical to gift certificates, could be used for any menu items, and would never identify someone as needing assistance. Margaret arrived for her usual Tuesday lunch unaware of the previous day's revelations. David was back behind the register, but this time his role was officially acknowledged. When she approached the counter, he smiled with the same warmth she had come to expect. "The usual?" he asked. "Actually," Margaret said, looking slightly embarrassed, "I wanted to ask about something. Yesterday you mentioned the soup was going to waste, and I was wondering, well, if that happens regularly, I might be able to help. I don't have much, but I could volunteer some time in exchange for a meal now and then." David's heart contracted. Even in her need, Margaret was looking for ways to give back, to maintain her dignity through contribution rather than charity. It was exactly the kind of thinking he had hoped the community fund would support. "That's a wonderful offer," he said. "Actually, we've just started a new program that might be perfect for you. It's called the Cornerstone Community Partnership, and we're looking for people to help us test new recipes, provide feedback on service, things like that. The time commitment is flexible, and we provide meals during volunteer sessions." It was a gentle fiction, a way for Margaret to receive assistance while feeling like a valued contributor. David had learned that sometimes the most important ingredient in kindness was creativity, finding ways to help that honored the recipient's need for dignity and purpose. Margaret's eyes lit up. "That sounds wonderful. I'd love to help." As David explained the program details, Sandra watched from the kitchen doorway. She had seen corporate executives implement charity programs before, tax-deductible donations that looked good in annual reports, but maintained clear divisions between givers and receivers. This was different. David was creating a community where help flowed naturally in all directions, where receiving assistance was reframed as partnership rather than dependence. Over the following weeks, the Cornerstone Community Fund grew beyond David's initial vision. Regular customers began contributing not just money but time and skills. A retired mechanic offered to maintain the restaurant's equipment in exchange for meals. A former marketing professional helped design promotional materials for community events. An unemployed teacher started offering tutoring sessions for local students in the restaurant's back room during slow afternoon hours. Margaret became one of the program's most enthusiastic participants. Her background in education made her a natural fit for menu development. She understood nutrition, had experience with dietary restrictions from years of managing school lunch programs, and possessed an intuitive sense of what foods would appeal to people in various circumstances. But more than her practical contributions, Margaret brought something invaluable to the program: the perspective of someone who understood both dignity and need. She helped David and Sandra refine the program's approach, suggesting ways to make assistance feel more natural and reciprocal. "People want to contribute," she explained during one of their planning sessions, "even when they're struggling, especially when they're struggling. The worst part of needing help isn't the need itself. It's feeling like you have nothing to offer in return." The success of the community fund attracted attention from local media and other restaurant owners. Food Network featured Cornerstone Bistro in a segment about restaurants making a community impact. The city council invited David to speak about public-private partnerships in addressing food insecurity. But the recognition also brought scrutiny. One morning in February, David arrived at the restaurant to find a small crowd of protesters outside. Their signs accused him of exploiting poverty for publicity, of using charity as a marketing gimmick, of gentrification disguised as community service. The protest was organized by Marcus Webb, a local activist who had seen too many well-intentioned programs fail when businesses prioritized public relations over genuine community engagement. Marcus had researched David's background and found the typical profile of a successful entrepreneur: wealthy, connected, with limited personal experience of the struggles his program claimed to address. "This is poverty tourism," Marcus told the reporter covering the protest. "Rich restaurant owner plays dress-up as a cashier for a few weeks, decides he understands struggle, then launches a charity program that makes him look good while keeping actual power structures intact." David watched the protest from inside the restaurant, feeling the criticism land with uncomfortable accuracy. Had he been engaging in a form of poverty tourism? Was the community fund genuinely helpful, or was it just a more sophisticated form of charity that made him feel better about his success? Margaret arrived for her usual Tuesday shift as a program volunteer, walking past the protesters with quiet determination. She found David sitting alone in the back room, staring at the wall. "Rough morning?" she asked gently. David looked up, his expression troubled. "Am I doing this for the right reasons, Margaret? The protesters out there, they're not entirely wrong. I do benefit from this program. It makes me feel good. It gets positive press for the restaurant. How do I know I'm not just using other people's struggles to feel better about my own success?" Margaret sat down across from him, considering the question with the same careful attention she had once given to difficult students. "Can I tell you about my first year of teaching?" she asked. David nodded. "I was 22, fresh out of college, assigned to a school in a low-income neighborhood. I came in full of idealism, convinced I was going to save these kids from their circumstances. I had all these assumptions about what they needed, what their families were like, what would motivate them. Margaret paused, remembering. I failed spectacularly that first year. The kids saw right through my savior complex. Their parents questioned my ability to understand their children's needs. I was so focused on being their rescuer that I forgot to listen to what they actually wanted. What changed? David asked. I started paying attention to what the kids and their families were already doing right, instead of focusing on what I thought they needed to fix. I learned to see strength where I had assumed weakness. I realized that my job wasn't to save anyone. It was to create opportunities for people to build on their existing strengths. Margaret met David's eyes. The difference between help and harm isn't whether you benefit from doing good. It's whether you center the actual needs and dignity of the people you're trying to help. Those protesters are angry because they've seen too many programs that prioritize the feelings of donors over the agency of recipients. So how do I know if I'm doing this right? David asked. Ask the people the program serves, Margaret said simply. Not just once, but regularly. Make sure they have real power to shape how it works. And be prepared to hear things you don't want to hear. That afternoon, David made an unprecedented decision. He walked outside and approached Marcus Webb directly, in full view of the protesters and media cameras. You're right, he said simply. I do benefit from this program, and I did make assumptions about what this community needs. I'd like to learn more about what we're doing wrong and how to do it better. Would you be willing to meet with our community advisory board? Marcus, who had been prepared for defensiveness or corporate deflection, was taken aback by the directness of David's response. You're serious? Completely serious, David replied. If this program is going to work, it needs to be accountable to the community it serves, not just to my intentions. The meeting that followed was uncomfortable but productive. Marcus and several other community advocates joined Margaret and other program participants to provide honest feedback about the community fund's impact and blind spots. The criticism was pointed, but constructive. The program had inadvertently created a two-tier system where voucher recipients felt marked as needy, despite efforts to maintain anonymity. The volunteer opportunities, while well-intentioned, were primarily designed around the restaurant's needs, rather than participants' skills and interests. Most significantly, the program was managed entirely by restaurant staff rather than being community-led. Here's the thing, Marcus explained during the meeting. Intent doesn't matter as much as impact. You can have the best intentions in the world, but if you're not giving the people you're trying to help real power over how that help works, you're still just imposing your solutions on their problems. David listened without defending, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. At the end of the meeting, he made a commitment that surprised everyone present. I want to restructure this completely, he said. Margaret, Marcus, everyone here, would you be willing to form an independent board to oversee the community fund? You would have final say over how resources are allocated, what programs are offered, how the fund operates. The restaurant would provide initial funding and space, but the community would control the implementation. It was a radical redistribution of power, one that many business owners would never consider. But David had learned enough from his time behind the register to understand that real change required real trust. The transition took months and was not without challenges. Disagreements arose about priorities and methods. Some original donors withdrew support when they realized they would no longer have control over how their contributions were used. Staff had to adjust to taking direction from community members rather than management. But slowly, something remarkable emerged. The program evolved into something more organic and responsive than David had ever imagined. Community members identified needs that restaurant staff had never noticed and developed solutions that were more creative and effective than top-down initiatives. A community garden was established in the empty lot behind the restaurant, providing fresh vegetables for meals and teaching opportunities for children. A tool library allowed community members to borrow equipment for home repairs and projects. A skill-sharing network connected people who needed services with neighbors who could provide them, creating economic opportunities that went far beyond free meals. Margaret emerged as a natural leader in the evolved program. Her teaching background and personal experience with both struggle and dignity making her an effective bridge between different community perspectives. She coordinated the volunteer tutoring program, managed the community garden's educational components, and helped design systems that honored both individual privacy and collective support. David found his role changing as well. He was no longer the benevolent owner providing charity to grateful recipients. Instead, he was a community partner who contributed resources while learning from neighbors who understood needs and solutions he had never considered. The transformation culminated on a warm evening in late spring when the restaurant hosted its first community appreciation dinner. Unlike typical charity events where donors were celebrated for their generosity, this gathering honored community members for their contributions to collective well-being. Margaret was recognized not as a recipient of help, but as an educational leader who had developed innovative programming. Marcus received appreciation for his advocacy work that had strengthened the entire initiative. Dozens of other community members were acknowledged for contributions ranging from garden maintenance to childcare to financial planning workshops. David spoke briefly, but his remarks focused entirely on what he had learned from community partners rather than what he had provided. "A year ago, I thought I understood hospitality," he said. "I thought it meant providing good service to paying customers. Now I understand that real hospitality means creating space where everyone can contribute their gifts to community well-being." As the evening wound down and neighbors lingered over dessert and conversation, David found himself washing dishes alongside Margaret in the restaurant's kitchen. It was a fitting reversal, the owner and the former customer working side by side, both contributing to the community they had helped create. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked as they worked. "Giving up control of the program? It would have been so much simpler to just keep it as restaurant charity." David considered the question as he dried a stack of plates. The program was indeed more complex now, more challenging to manage, less predictable in its outcomes. But it was also more alive, more responsive, more genuinely useful to the people it served. "Simple would have been easier," he said finally. "But simple wouldn't have taught me what I needed to learn." Which was that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, David said. It's community. And community isn't something you can buy or provide. It's something you have to build together. Margaret smiled, recognizing the wisdom that comes not from success, but from the willingness to question that success and grow beyond it. "Not bad for a former cashier," she said with gentle teasing. David laughed, remembering his weeks behind the register when anonymity had allowed him to see clearly for the first time in years. "Best job I ever had," he said, and meant it completely. The Cornerstone Community Fund became a model replicated by restaurants and businesses across the country. But its real success was never measured in media coverage or awards. It was measured in the lives that intertwined around shared purpose, in the transformation of transactions into relationships, in the recognition that everyone has something valuable to contribute when given the opportunity and respect to do so. Margaret never returned to counting coins for soup, but she never forgot the dignity that had been preserved by a stranger's kindness, or the power that had been unleashed when that kindness evolved into genuine partnership. And David never forgot the lesson learned behind a register, that sometimes the most important business metric is simply how many people go home feeling seen, valued, and fed. Years later, when business students studied the Cornerstone model, they often focused on the innovative funding mechanisms or the community engagement strategies. But those who understood it best recognized that its foundation was simpler and more radical. The belief that every person who walks through the door has something valuable to offer, and that true hospitality means creating space for those offerings to flourish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.